So I'm Caroline Burry, and I'm very pleased to be here and more than a little daunted by the presentations that have gone before, but I know it's a friendly audience, and I'm looking forward to your input and feedback and hope to contribute a little piece to the puzzle of this conference. So as you know, I looked at mothers involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. And I wanted to start with one of my favorite concepts, equifinality, meaning there are lots of different ways to end up at the same place. So we've all ended up here at this conference by many different literal paths in terms of geography, as well as paths and areas of interest. And what brought me to this particular topic was long-time work in child welfare, as well as working with defendants facing the death penalty. And so I'll start with a quick story. Alex, who was 7, was a little boy in Baltimore City, which is where my school is, my school of social work. And he lived in an intact family with his mom and his dad and his younger sister. His dad had previously been incarcerated, had had a lot of difficulties maintaining employment after that. And please know there is no excuse ever for a murder. But the circumstances were that another gentleman invited Alex's father to drive the getaway car in a planned jewelry store robbery. And somehow Alex's dad ended up inside the jewelry store. There was a police officer who was working as a security guard as a second job, who was guarding the store, and there was a fight between the 3 men, and the police officer was shot and died. So both men were caught immediately, and the other defendant offered to testify against Alex's father, so the other defendant did not face the death penalty, even though it was absolutely not clear who had fired the gun. And so Alex went to school. He was in the 2nd grade, and he went to school back to school a couple of days later. And I had been asked already to work with his father, and I'll just very briefly mention that. But Alex went to school. The last day he went to school, actually, for approximately 2 years, because that day he walked into his classroom, and his teacher leaned over to him and said, "I saw your father on the news last night. They're going to fry him in the electric chair." And Alex became electively mute. This was his beloved teacher, whom actually his mother said he had a big crush on, as only a 7-year-old can, on a apparently young and enthusiastic teacher. He developed such a severe school phobia that they actually arranged for him to be taught at home. But what does that do about the pillar of school? The upshot of that, and my ongoing prior to that and afterwards, is that this was some years ago, and I really, even more than ever, paid attention to children with incarcerated parents. And Alex, as so many Alexes that you know, didn't do anything, but he was severely punished for the crime of his father. And so And then just quick, the death penalty piece. I don't do anything with guilt or innocence, but in the U.S., when you're facing the death penalty, if you're convicted of a crime that carries a death penalty, then there's a second hearing, and the prosecution goes first. It's like the scales of justice. The prosecution goes first and says, here are all the reasons why the defendant should get the death penalty. And the defense then goes and says, here are the reasons why the defendant should get life without parole. Because we're not talking release at that point. We're just talking death or life without parole. And so in this part of the hearing, there's a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that says that a social worker or other qualified person has to present a background of the defendant, not to excuse anything, but to help explain why he or she might have turned out to be so dangerous. And so what a surprise. Most of my clients, men and women, and I have had both, I had quite a few female clients as well, have histories of childhood maltreatment, trauma, toxic stress, and so on. So Alex brought me to thinking not just about my child welfare piece of children of incarcerated parents, which was primarily looking at children in foster care because of their parental incarceration, but looking at children, whether they were in care or not, and the impact on them. So the current study, with tremendous support, which I appreciate, from Kathy Flynn in Australia, so far as interview guide and guidance for interviewing incarcerated parents. I had the opportunity to look at mothers in a hospital in the UK who were involuntarily committed, or they would say, or perhaps you would say, sectioned under the Mental Health Act to a psychiatric hospital. And my strong belief, and I think I'm going to make the case, hope to make the case to you, that while this is a hidden population within almost a hidden population of children of incarcerated parents, they're often not included because the parents aren't in our research, because the parents aren't in a correctional facility, they're in a psychiatric hospital. So, as with men, some women with criminal charges and significant mental health issues are sectioned, more are imprisoned, and it's so not clear as to which path you're going to go down. And that's been something that has been not clearly studied in the literature, although what we do know is that there do seem to be some differences based on who you are, as to whether you are, and even in the States, sometimes allowed to go, especially pre-trial, into voluntarily into a psychiatric or substance abuse treatment center, which then, if you have the resources to do that, you have additional evidence to bring into your trial as to your interest in rehabilitation, which folks without resources don't get to do. So we have not a clear idea as to which of our parents who are involved criminally, who have forensic issues, end up in psychiatric hospitals, and except for the floridly psychotic, in which end up imprisoned. And again, not clear when we're just looking at women. There are statistics on parents in psychiatric hospitals, but they're not very broken down into categories. So we think it's probably parallel to the numbers of imprisoned women who have minor children, which is a pretty large number. So we also know as background research that when you compare women to men, whether or not they're mothers, because we don't, or fathers, we don't know that, but they do experience in the UK and in the US longer, more remote hospitalizations because there are fewer beds and spaces, which directly affects, of course, family contact if you're further away from your family. So women end up further, mothers end up further away from their families and children. The detainments might be in settings where family visits are difficult or impossible, and particularly women who require the most secure placements are the most disadvantaged. And that's in the scanty literature I've been able to locate, that seems to be true wherever you are, is that women are likely to be placed further, whether it's a psychiatric hospital or a prison, further away than our men's, and the more secure hospitalization needed, the less likely you are to be anywhere close to your family. So we know about outcomes, and the question I'm going to ask you at this point and circle back around to is there anything, if I hadn't told you that this was with a population of mothers in a psychiatric hospital, would you have otherwise seen it as the results as any different from just imprisoned mothers? So you have the challenges for these children, not only of the parents being incarcerated, which they are, but also a mother with serious mental illness and stigma. So it's really stigma on stigma of having the mental illness as well as the criminal charges and being sectioned. Love this quote. What was clear was that the joys and sorrows of motherhood clearly existed for these women, and these were women in a psychiatric hospital, the same as they would for any non-ill mother. And why wouldn't they? The joys and the sorrows of motherhood. So we had a little pilot project, and one was with two aims. And the first aim, which I'm not going to focus on, but I'm really interested in interdisciplinary work. So I was able to take an interdisciplinary team of students with me from University of Maryland to conduct this study in the south of England. And secondly, to begin to develop some qualitative themes to set the stage for future research. So on the UK side, we had two PIs, a social work senior lecturer and a forensic psychiatrist, and then we had one UK student who was a social work student. And on the US side, we had me, two social work students, a law student, a pharmacy doctoral student, and a master's of nursing student. So we had a handful of professions with different perspectives coming to the interview process, which made it really, really interesting. Volunteers were recruited by hospital staff from women who were mothers and who had forensic charges in this unit. And then we get to the numbers. So we started with 15. In fact, when we left the US, we had 15. When we got to down to the South Coast, we had 10 between transfers and discharges. And then we were there for a little over a week of interviews, and during that week, and of course we were completely accepting, though disappointed, that our 10 went down to 5, that the staff deemed able to have an interview at that point. And of course, our primary overarching aim was to elicit views from women who were in a place that they were able to do that, but not to, because they were very sensitive subjects that we were going to talk about, and not to put anyone at any greater risk about that. So our numbers pretty much nosedived. We interviewed them in private rooms by appointment, and the facility was amazing. They let the women say, there weren't a lot of options, but there were several different rooms, and they allowed them to say where they wanted to be interviewed. We were not allowed to record, and certainly there would have been probably some participants who wouldn't have wanted to be recorded. But we were allowed to take notes, and we also provided pencils and paper to the women who were being interviewed and encouraged them to take notes as well, which I think is only a gracious thing to do. And most of them did take some notes while they were being interviewed. And we had a PI and a student research team member conduct each interview. And as expected, the women we interviewed had significant mental health disorders, and actually one with schizophrenia, 4 with mood disorders, and 5 with personality disorders, which adds up to more than 5, but there were multiple diagnoses. And these were both shared by the women, but also as confirmed by the staff, and they were completely accurate there was a complete match between what they shared. All but one of the participants also met the criteria for substance use related conditions. Probably not a surprise there. So, planning for their children's care across the board. They believed that most believed they'd not been included to a small extent. 2 of the women said they had been asked/told about the plan, so they thought they were a little bit included. And what was particularly interesting, it's all very interesting to me, but that one of the women who was included, her child was an adult with special needs, so he was not a minor, but he needed planning as much as any other vulnerable young person might. And she believed she was completely excluded for planning for him. And that was a tremendously traumatizing experience for her, given her son's diagnoses as she described them, that change was very difficult for him, and the fact that people came in a van and took him away, and he doesn't communicate very well. Was really, really challenging, and that I have to say that was not something that I had really thought about before. That when we're talking about, I should know as a mother, my children who are in their one in his 20s and 2 in their 30s seem to need me just as much now as they ever did. But when you're thinking about mothers, you're still a mother, and particularly when you have an adult child with special needs. We asked them, how do you define yourself? Who are you? Now, they knew we were interviewing about their role as mothers, so even saying that we probably influenced the outcome of this set of questions, but across the board, they said that was their most important role, their most important self-identity. At the same time, they volunteered that they did not believe anyone saw them in their system, really saw them as mothers, or saw that role was an important role for them. Yep. Yeah, I don't know why that says incarcerated. I did a find in, well, it should have said sectioned. They wanted to stay connected with their children, however that could happen. But again, does this seem any different from any other population we've been discussing the last few days? Transportation issues. This was not an area that was very easy to reach where this was located, and some of the women were from literally hundreds of miles from home, as far as you could get from the South Coast. Visitation hours, although the facility worked to have some flexibility, there was only so much flexibility they could offer due to staffing. Tremendous lack of support from caregivers. Only one of our mothers said that she had the full support of the caregiver of her children to participate in visitation, and the rest had limited to no support in visiting. And there's a sense of, you take maybe all of the issues of visiting someone in a prison with the idea of taking someone to visit, taking a youngster to visit in a secure psychiatric facility, and again, someone with criminal charges. The moms also had ambivalence about having their children see them there, and trying to sort out, as one mother said very memorably, what's best for me, what's best for him, trying to balance that out. I think it's best for both of us to be in touch, but is visiting in person the best or not? And it's really not possible to come into this facility without seeing other patients there. And sometimes that, as it can be disturbing and challenging to see some of the behavior one observes in a jail, it can also be disturbing to see and confusing, especially for a youngster, to see some behavior that you might see in a psychiatric hospital. Phone and letter contact was very, very meaningful, and I will say the facility was tremendously open to supporting those two kinds of supports, much more than most prisons. In the U.S., for instance, you have to pay, you have to have money to call home, and it's very expensive. The prisons contract with private providers to provide service, and so a lot of folks in jails and prisons in America can't afford to make calls to their family, and they certainly can't receive calls within the prison. But this hospital did a really terrific job. They had absolutely, unless the physician for the psychiatrist for the particular patient thought the patient shouldn't have phone contact, then they had pretty unlimited phone contact. Paper, pencils, stamps were provided. So those types of contact were very supported.
Were they allowed cell phones?
No, not allowed cell phones, but there were phones that they could speak with some privacy, although someone was always in the area. Someone's always in the area in the forensic unit. And so when I say all contact supervised in some way, no one was listening in. They did not. All calls in the United States from a prison can be recorded, and most of them are. These calls were not recorded, and there was some sense of privacy, as I saw the room where they usually made phone calls, and someone would be across the room, and so there was a real sense of privacy. But again, the visits, everything, there was always supervision, and balancing protection and privacy is a bit challenging. mothers were conflicted over what their role should be and how much to disclose about their situation, whether they should be explaining where they were in the court process as to whether they would go to a jail, go to another hospital, whether they would be discharged to the community, but to a day treatment program. And part of that ambivalence was, or part of the conflict was because most of them were not clear as to what the outcomes were going to be for them, and they worried about promising things that weren't going to happen. When participants learned that their children were having difficulties, and I just shorthand put acting out, but there was a whole range of from more internalizing behaviors to externalizing behaviors, whether those happened during visits, during contact, or they were told about them. They were very frustrated and anxious, and the treatment team members said that were concerns about parenting for because again, this was on the women's side, for the moms, was when things were going well, that was the strongest support they had to work for effective treatment. And when things weren't going well with their children, and don't we all know this, you're only as happy as your unhappiest child, is our saying. And so for these moms, with all of their other worries and concerns, if their children were not doing well in some ways, it really impacted their treatment, actually. Lack of understanding about the legal process, which I touched on a minute ago. Previously unacknowledged, untreated, or both substance use. And as we know, it's hard to tease out what's the cause, what's the effect of substance use when it's co-occurring with mental illness. But complicated their treatment, complicated their, as they were, the ones we saw had become stable within the hospital, hence we were allowed to interview them, concerns about their substance use and how that had affected their children along the way. Fear of custody disputes, that they would lose custody or lose or have the local authorities, the social services involved with their children, which is a fear that turned out to be pretty realistic as they shared some of the outcomes that they had experienced, and again, not clear about their rights. What helped them do better was the meaningful contact, the feeling supported, including being just recognized as mothers, and the staff had said that as a result of, they thought they had been sensitive about the parenting role, but small change as a result of having our group there doing the research study, when we did a lot of processing afterwards, that they really had redoubled their efforts to recognize the importance of the mothering role. And so we were very pleased to hear that. Parenting after hospitalization, this was an area where we got a lot less information than we had expected, mostly because of the uncertainties. Mothers were very willing to tell us what they hoped would happen, and we actually changed the question. Our questions, instead of what are your plans, but we instead asked, what do you hope will happen and what do you think will happen? And that made it more clear for them and for us that they had their wishes and dreams, and then they had an idea And sometimes what they thought would happen is they really don't know, but they wanted an opportunity to say what they would hope would happen, including some moms who said, if I'm going to be released fairly soon, I don't think I'm ready to take on full-time parenting again, that I think I'm being encouraged to go to a day treatment program, and I really see some value in that I don't ever want to be in this position again, and I don't think I'm going to be ready to go from being in a hospital to being out in the community directly without. And of course, there is a nice step down, I should say of course, because that's not true everywhere, but from this hospital, a nice step down program. So, very small, a wee pilot study. The participants volunteered, but they were also screened by the staff, and as I've already said, screened down, understandably. There's a lack of ethnic and racial diversity, although we did have a broad range of age. From, I think our youngest mom was 22, and our eldest was 52. So we had a broad range there. I didn't say this, but earlier, but women who had harmed their children were not in the study, which probably seems obvious, but I just should have said that. They were screened out by staff. And women with postpartum depression, which actually there were several apparently at that moment in time, and typically they had between 1 and 3 women with severe postpartum depression, and they were also, the staff thought, should not be in the study. But it is one of the first of its kind. We did identify some themes and have an opportunity, I think, to begin to look at the great similarities. Did you hear great similarities between these moms and moms elsewhere? And maybe some differences, and work on developing more information and knowledge. I think we did pull some implications, the primacy of the parental role, the need to support meaningful contact. Again, these sound like our same implications we've had all week, so I find that affirming. Partnering with mothers in planning, and one of the strongest motivators to treatment involvement is or are the patient's child or children. So I clicked off too fast, but I hope by including them in our studies and practice innovations, we can, what do you think we can do? Yes, support them better. Look at alternatives to incarceration or to forensic incarceration. It's our jails in the U.S. have become actually de facto mental institutions, and so the distinctions are very, very blurred. I am proud to say that the dean of my school, who is the president of the American Academy of the Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, has issued 12 grand challenges for social work, and decarceration, smart decarceration is one. And so we're really in a place where we're hoping and believing that we can start to make a difference in some of these. So thanks for your attention and time, and for the work that you do. Yeah. The end.